Judge Langford, you have ruled over this courtroom for 24 years, but today, justice is no longer on your side. The words sliced through the tension in the courtroom like a knife. Every set of eyes turned toward Judge Rebecca Langford, who had presided over the room for more than 2 decades, earning respect for her sharp mind and unwavering sense of justice. But today, there was no respect in the air, only cold, biting uncertainty. Her composure faltered as the weight of the accusation bore down on her. Ethan Miller, a young attorney with an unshakable sense of purpose, stood before the courtroom, his gaze fixed firmly on the judge as he moved to the center of the room. His voice carried the sharp edge of both anger and righteousness. His steps were calculated, deliberate, as if each movement was part of a well-thought-out plan. Judge Langford, Ethan continued, his voice steady but laced with an undeniable accusation, for the past 24 years, you've manipulated this courtroom to serve your own twisted agenda. You've accepted bribes from the very people you were supposed to protect the public from. You've condemned innocent lives to rot in prison, while the true criminals walked free. And you've kept all of it hidden, thinking that no one would ever dare challenge your authority. The courtroom fell into a tense silence. Gasps spread through the spectators as they absorbed the gravity of his words. Murmurs ran through the room, some in disbelief, others in shock. Those who had once revered her now seemed to question everything they thought they knew about their long-serving judge. Judge Langford's hands trembled slightly as she placed them on the edge of her desk, her knuckles whitening as she gripped the surface. For the first time in years, doubt crept into her mind, a feeling she had long thought beneath her. Her heart beat faster, her breath more shallow. Despite her years of experience, her usual unshakable poise had begun to crack. Ethan's eyes never left hers. He continued, each word striking like a hammer, chipping away at the walls she had so carefully constructed around herself. You thought you could escape the consequences of your actions, hiding behind that gavel. But today, everything changes. Today, the truth will come to light. Rebecca Langford's gaze hardened, a fleeting moment of vulnerability masked by a sudden flash of defiance. Her reputation, everything she had worked for, was unraveling before her eyes, but she wouldn't go down without a fight. Yet, for the first time in her life, she was unsure whether the fight was worth it. Outside the courtroom, the world waited in anticipation. The crowd gathered outside was a sea of expectant faces, each one anticipating the fall of a giant. The storm that had been brewing for years was about to break, and Judge Langford, once an immovable force in the legal world, was now at the center of it. The question was no longer whether she could control the outcome, but whether she could survive the truth. The weight of Ethan Miller's words crashed down like a gavel striking its final verdict. A hush fell over the courtroom, thick, suffocating, and absolute. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, but no one dared to move, no one dared to speak. It was as if the very walls of the courtroom, the same walls that had witnessed years of trials and judgments, were now holding their breath, waiting for what would come next. At the judge's bench, Judge Margaret Langford sat frozen, her fingers tightening ever so slightly around the polished wood of her gavel. The words still echoed in her ears, sharp and unforgiving, Tam Fan Langford, ba de Dieu Kien Fong Suan Nai Sut 24 Nam, and Hung Ham Ne, Song Ly Kong Kan Dung Vi Phia Ba Noa. For the first time in her long career, she felt the balance of power shift, tilting against her. A bead of sweat traced a slow, uncertain path down her temple, but she did not lift a hand to wipe it away. Her breath, usually measured and calm, felt uneven, shallow. In the courtroom, she had always been untouchable, an immovable force, the final authority. But now, sitting beneath the weight of Ethan Miller's unwavering gaze, she felt something foreign grip her chest, fear. Ethan took a step forward, his presence commanding but steady. His voice had been calm, deliberate, but beneath it lay an undercurrent of righteous fury, years in the making. He had waited for this moment. He had spent sleepless nights poring over documents, tracing the tendrils of corruption that stretched from the darkest corners of the legal system all the way to the woman who now sat before him. Every bribe, every manipulated verdict, every life destroyed, it had all led to this reckoning. Judge Langford's mind raced, grasping for a defense, for an escape, but none came. the accusations weren't new to her. She had always known this day might come. She had taken calculated risks, had built an empire of power within the justice system, believing herself invincible. But now, as Ethan peeled back the carefully constructed layers of her legacy, revealing the rot beneath, she felt her composure slipping. Her throat tightened. She wanted to respond, to refute, to deny, to dismiss him with the authority she had wielded for decades. But her voice betrayed her, caught somewhere between anger and panic. Ethan let the silence settle, his eyes never leaving hers. He could see it, the cracks forming in her mask. The years of control, of carefully measured expressions, were beginning to wane. He watched as her lips parted slightly, then pressed together again, as if weighing whether to fight or surrender. "You knew this day would come," Ethan finally said, his voice softer now but no less resolute. "You silenced witnesses. You buried evidence. You sat on that bench and pretended to be the voice of justice while letting the guilty walk free. But justice has a way of catching up, even to those who believe themselves untouchable." Judge Langford inhaled sharply. The urge to lash out burned within her, to strike back at him with the authority she had wielded for years. But what good was authority when the truth had already poisoned the air around her? The weight of her choices, the bribes, the backroom deals, the innocent lives she had condemned, pressed against her chest like a vice. Her fingers trembled against the gavel. She had held that gavel for 24 years, had used it to dictate the fate of others. But today, it felt like it no longer belonged to her. Today, she was not the one handing down judgment, she was the one standing trial. The room remained suffocatingly still. The spectators, the lawyers, the journalists scribbling hurried notes, every pair of eyes in that courtroom was locked onto her, waiting. Waiting for a response, for an excuse, for a reaction that might change the course of what they already knew to be true. But there was no escape. Ethan had laid her sins bare for the world to see. And as Judge Langford sat there, staring into the cold, unrelenting face of justice, she knew her reign was over. The courtroom, once a place where Judge Langford's authority was absolute, now felt suffocating. The wooden bench beneath her suddenly seemed too rigid, too cold, as if rejecting her presence. The weight of Ethan Miller's accusations pressed against her like an invisible force, making it difficult to breathe. Around her, the air was thick with tension, the collective anticipation of the courtroom pressing in on all sides. The spectators sat in stunned silence, their eyes darting between Ethan and the judge, searching for the cracks in her once impenetrable armor. The journalists in the gallery, pens poised and cameras flashing, were ready to immortalize the downfall of a woman who had once commanded unchallenged respect. The walls, the very walls that had shielded her for 24 years, now felt as though they were closing in, leaving no space to escape. Judge Langford's fingers curled around the polished edge of her bench, her nails digging into the wood as if anchoring herself. She could feel her heartbeat hammering against her ribs, but she refused to let it show. No. She was Judge Eleanor Langford, and no man, no matter how determined, would bring her down without a fight. She drew in a slow breath, steadying herself before speaking. "This is absurd," she declared, her voice sharp, but there was a slight tremor beneath the steel. "I will not sit here and entertain baseless accusations from a man who has no authority in my courtroom." Ethan took a step forward, unfazed, his expression unwavering. The confidence in his stance, in his voice, made the air feel even heavier. "Your courtroom," he echoed, his tone laced with quiet defiance. "Judge Langford, this was never your courtroom. It belongs to the people. And today, they're here to see the truth." A murmur rippled through the audience, breaking the silence. For the first time, Langford saw the shift happening in real time, the uncertainty flickering across the faces of those who had once looked at her with reverence. She caught the eye of the bailiff, a man who had served by her side for years, always enforcing her orders without question. But now, even he hesitated, his expression clouded with doubt. A cold chill ran down her spine. Ethan moved deliberately, reaching for the worn leather briefcase at his side. The metallic click of the locks echoed in the silent courtroom as he pulled it open. His hands were steady, too steady, as he retrieved a thick, weathered folder and placed it on the prosecution's table with an air of finality. "This," he said, flipping the file open, "is a record of every case you tampered with. Every bribe you accepted. Every innocent person you condemned while letting the guilty walk free." He met her gaze, his voice unwavering, his words sharp as a blade. 24 years of corruption, Judge Langford. And today, it all comes to light. The judge's throat went dry. Her grip tightened on the bench as if she could keep control by sheer force of will. She willed herself not to show weakness, but the walls around her had begun to crack. A bead of sweat traced a slow path down her temple. "This is nonsense," she snapped, but the fire in her voice wavered, betraying her. Ethan let the silence stretch, his unwavering gaze pinning her in place. When he finally spoke, his words were measured, deliberate, delivered not as an argument, but as a challenge. "Then prove me wrong." The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Langford's chest tightened. She could feel their eyes on her, watching, waiting. The very people who had once trusted her, who had respected her, now studied her as if she were nothing more than a criminal on trial. For the first time in her career, Eleanor Langford had no response. And that, more than anything, terrified her. Judge Eleanor Langford's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of her mahogany bench, her knuckles turning ghostly white. The weight of the accusations pressed against her chest like an iron vice, making it harder to breathe. The silence in the courtroom was unbearable, thick, suffocating, and laced with an anticipation that made every second stretch into eternity. Every pair of eyes was locked onto her, some filled with morbid curiosity, others with barely concealed contempt. For years, she had commanded this very room with an iron fist, her word final, her judgment absolute. And now, she was the one on trial. Across the room, Ethan Miller stood poised, unwavering, his presence dominating the space in a way that made it clear he was in control now. The thick dossier lay open before him, pages filled with damning evidence meticulously compiled over years of investigation. Every document, every bank statement, every witness testimony was a dagger aimed at the heart of her legacy. Langford wanted to dismiss it, to denounce it as slander, a fabrication, a desperate attempt to undermine her, but deep down, she knew the truth. The walls she had so carefully built around herself were collapsing, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The tension in the room was electric, buzzing through the air like a current ready to ignite. Even the bailiff, a man who had worked alongside her for over a decade, avoided her gaze. The reporters, who had once hung onto her rulings with admiration, were now armed with pens and cameras, ready to immortalize her downfall. The jury members, their expressions unreadable, sat in rigid silence. Langford swallowed hard, forcing herself to straighten her spine. She had ruled this courtroom for 24 years. She had buried scandals, crushed opposition, and ensured that justice, her version of it, always prevailed. She had been untouchable. But now, as she looked at the mountain of evidence before her, she felt something foreign, something she had rarely encountered in her long career: fear. She cleared her throat, willing steel into her voice. "This is nothing but slander," she said, though the slight tremor in her tone betrayed her. "An orchestrated attack by a man with a vendetta." Ethan's expression remained unreadable. He didn't flinch, didn't react with the outrage she had hoped for. Instead, he simply reached for another document, lifting it for the courtroom to see. A bank statement, one of many, detailing illicit transactions, bribes, hidden accounts, payoffs she had thought were buried too deep to ever surface. "No vendetta, Judge Langford," Ethan said, his voice steady, measured. "Just the truth." A murmur swept through the courtroom like a wave crashing against a fragile shore. Spectators leaned in, whispering among themselves. The jury exchanged glances, their eyes flickering with something dangerous: conviction. Langford could feel the energy in the room shifting, slipping out of her grasp like sand through her fingers. Her pulse pounded in her ears, drowning out the noise, the whispers, the clicking of cameras capturing the moment of her reckoning. She clenched her fists beneath the table, nails digging into her palms. She had gotten out of tight situations before, twisted narratives to her favor, wielded her power like a sword to silence those who dared challenge her. But this time, the blade was aimed at her. Panic coiled in her gut, a slow, suffocating dread that threatened to consume her. There had to be a way out, a loophole, an angle, something she could use to regain control. She scanned the room, searching for an ally, a weak link, someone she could manipulate. But all she found were cold, impassive faces. The realization hit her like a hammer. There would be no escape this time. For the first time in 24 years, Judge Eleanor Langford stood in her own courtroom, not as a figure of authority, but as a woman cornered by the very justice she had spent her life distorting. And this time, there was no gavel that could silence the truth. Judge Eleanor Langford had spent decades shaping this courtroom into her domain, a place where her word was law and her authority unquestioned. But now, standing in the very chamber that had once been her sanctuary, she felt the weight of judgment pressing down on her, not as the wielder of justice, but as its target. The air was thick with tension, suffocating, as Ethan Miller held up yet another damning piece of evidence. A document, one she had signed nearly 20 years ago. It was an order that had condemned an innocent man to prison while allowing a wealthy and well-connected defendant to walk free. The ink had long dried, but its consequences had never faded. And now, the truth was staring her in the face, cold and unforgiving. Gasps rippled through the courtroom like a wave, punctuated by murmurs of disbelief. Some spectators sat frozen, their eyes wide with shock. Others leaned toward each other, whispering accusations and confirmations of long-held suspicions. Langford felt the weight of their stares, piercing through the thick barrier of authority she had once wrapped around herself. Her heart pounded against her ribs. Her breath was shallow, each inhale feeling like a struggle against an invisible force tightening around her. For years, she had prided herself on her composure, on her ability to maintain an ironclad grip on every case that passed through her courtroom. But now, that control was slipping through her fingers like grains of sand. Ethan stepped forward, his voice sharp, deliberate. For years, you sat in that chair, wielding justice like a weapon, deciding who walked free and who suffered, not based on law, but on influence. You manipulated cases, silenced whistleblowers, and profited from the very system you swore to uphold. He let the words hang in the air for a moment before delivering the final blow. But today, Judge Langford, there is no robe to shield you. No title to protect you. Today, the law stands above you. Langford opened her mouth, but no words came. Her throat was dry, her mind grasping for some sort of defense, some explanation, some escape. But there was none. The weight of her past, of every decision she had made to serve her own interests rather than justice, had finally caught up with her. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the glass of water on the desk, but even that betrayed her. The ice rattled against the glass, the sound deafening in the suffocating silence. She lifted it to her lips, but it did nothing to quench the dryness in her mouth. Her gaze darted to the jury, 12 strangers who now held the power she once wielded so effortlessly. Their expressions were unreadable, but she could feel their judgment, silent yet suffocating. Her eyes then flickered to the spectators, to the faces of people she had ruled over with impunity. Some looked at her with anger, others with satisfaction. A few, with the hollow pain of lives ruined by her hand. Then, from the back of the courtroom, a voice rang out, shattering the silence. "What do you have to say now, Judge Langford?" It was a former defendant, someone she had sentenced unjustly, someone whose plea she had ignored all those years ago. His voice was steady, but beneath it, she heard the echoes of his suffering. The room stilled. All eyes turned to her. Langford's grip on the glass tightened until her knuckles turned white. Her pride screamed at her to fight back, to deny, to defy. She had built her entire career on the notion that she was untouchable. But now, stripped of her power, faced with the undeniable truth of her own corruption, the realization took root in her mind. She was no longer the judge. She was the accused. Judge Langford sat rigidly at the defendant's table, her fingers curled tightly around the edge of the polished wood. The once familiar courtroom, where she had presided over hundreds of cases, now felt foreign, hostile, even. The very walls that had once echoed her judgments now bore witness to her downfall. She had built her life around power, control, and absolute authority. But now, those things had slipped through her grasp, leaving behind nothing but cold, suffocating uncertainty. The prosecutor, Ethan Miller, was relentless. His voice was calm, measured, yet each word struck like a hammer against the crumbling foundation of her legacy. Witness after witness came forward, each testimony unraveling the pristine image of justice she had carefully constructed over the years. A former court clerk stood at the stand, her voice trembling yet unwavering. I saw her dismiss crucial evidence in multiple cases. I knew it was wrong, but who was I to question Judge Langford? Her words were laced with the regret of someone who had been complicit, even if by silence. Then came a defense attorney, a man who had once shared quiet smiles with her over rulings that benefited their mutual interests. Now, there was no warmth in his gaze, only cold resolve. I was there when she negotiated behind closed doors, ensuring verdicts fell in favor of the powerful. I was part of the system, but she was the one who ruled it with an iron fist. Langford clenched her jaw, her nails pressing into her palm. She could feel the weight of every eye in the room pressing down on her, like vultures circling a dying beast. This was her courtroom. These were her people. Yet today, there was no deference, no respect, only judgment. Then, the final witness took the stand. Robert Hayes. The air in the courtroom thickened as the elderly man approached the microphone. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his glasses, his gaze fixed on Langford with quiet intensity. He looked older than she remembered, his hair grayer, his face lined with years of hardship. She had not thought of him in decades. She had not needed to. I was accused of a crime I did not commit, Robert said, his voice steady despite the emotion simmering beneath the surface. I had proof of my innocence. I begged for a fair trial. I pleaded to be heard. But Judge Langford, he inhaled deeply, his fingers tightening around the edge of the witness stand, she silenced me. Just as she silenced so many others. A sharp, hushed murmur rippled through the courtroom. Langford's throat tightened. She remembered his case. A petty theft charge, yet he had been sentenced harshly, too harshly. She had dismissed his evidence without a second glance, convinced that his guilt was a foregone conclusion. He had been just another defendant, another name on a docket. Nothing more. But now, he was everything. For the first time in her life, she felt the weight of injustice not as a judge, but as the accused. Her pulse pounded against her temples. She had seen countless defendants crumble under her judgment, watched them wither under the weight of her gavel. She had never imagined what it felt like to be on the other side. The shame. The helplessness. The sickening awareness that no plea, no explanation, could change the outcome. She scanned the faces in the courtroom, searching for a sign, any sign, that she could still claw her way out of this. A sympathetic glance, a flicker of doubt. There was none. Only cold, unwavering certainty. Ethan Miller stepped forward, his presence commanding, his expression devoid of pity. He let the silence stretch, making sure Langford felt the full gravity of the moment. Then, in a voice that cut through the tension like a blade, he asked, "Judge Langford, do you deny these allegations?" Her mouth felt dry. Her hands trembled slightly, though she clenched them into fists to stop the shaking. Every instinct screamed at her to fight back, to assert her dominance as she always had. But the walls were closing in. The truth, once buried beneath years of authority and influence, had clawed its way to the surface. There was no escape. For the first time in her life, Judge Langford had no verdict to deliver, only one to await. The courtroom was thick with tension. For a brief moment, time seemed to stand still as everyone waited for the verdict. 12 jurors sat rigidly, their faces etched with concentration, while a soft murmur of anticipation filled the air. The room was far too quiet, too still, like a storm just before the first crack of thunder. All eyes were on the jury box, and all eyes were on Judge Langford, who had been their leader for so long. Margaret Langford, once an indomitable figure, stood there at the defendant's table, her posture straight but tense. Her chest rose and fell with each breath, but it felt as though she wasn't breathing at all. The truth was, her world had shattered around her, and she was trying, desperately, to hold on to something that no longer existed. Power. Control. Authority. The jury foreman, a woman with sharp eyes and a cold demeanor, slowly stood up, clutching a small, folded piece of paper in her hand. It was the paper that would define everything, the end of her career, the death of her legacy. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest, but Margaret kept her face carefully composed. No emotions. Not here. Not in front of them. The foreman cleared her throat, her voice carrying through the silence of the room with unsettling clarity. In the case of the People versus Margaret Langford, on the charges of judicial corruption, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. She paused, her eyes briefly meeting Langford's, though the older woman could see no empathy there, only the cold inevitability of the moment. Langford's breath hitched. She gripped the edge of the table tighter, her knuckles whitening. Her body trembled slightly as she tried to suppress the growing panic, the realization that this was it, this was her reckoning. The foreman continued, each word slicing through the air with the force of a guillotine. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty on all counts. It felt like the ground had been ripped from beneath her. Guilty. The word hit her like a punch to the stomach. The room seemed to blur at the edges, the faces of the spectators in the gallery becoming nothing more than a mass of indistinct figures. Her own heartbeat thundered in her ears, and for a split second, she forgot to breathe. But she forced herself to stay composed. She had to. In the back of her mind, a wave of denial surged. This couldn't be happening. She was Judge Langford, for God's sake. For 24 years, she had been the one who dispensed justice. She had sat at the pinnacle of power in that courtroom. How could they possibly do this to her? But the gavel came down. Once. Twice, the sound was final, unyielding. The voice of the presiding judge, the one who had taken over her position during this trial, broke through her dazed thoughts. Sentencing will be held next week, she said, her voice ringing in the stillness. Bail is denied. The defendant will be remanded into custody immediately. Langford felt a cold shiver run through her. Remanded, her mind stumbled over the word, as if it were an alien concept, something that couldn't possibly apply to her. Two uniformed officers stepped forward, their steps purposeful and unwavering. They had been waiting for this moment, and now it was upon them. One of them reached for her wrist, and without a word, slipped the cold, unforgiving metal of handcuffs around her. The weight of them was heavier than she ever expected, more suffocating than any punishment she had ever imposed on another. As they led her away, Langford's mind seemed to go numb, but her body felt like it was moving in slow motion. Every step felt as though it took hours, each one dragging her further into the reality of her fall from grace. She could feel the eyes of everyone on her. Former colleagues. Lawyers. Defendants she had once ruled over with absolute authority. Their gazes were sharp, unforgiving, and yet she could sense something else. There was no sympathy. No compassion. Only the unyielding sense of justice being done. She dared a glance at the gallery, and the faces staring back at her were as impassive as stone. Some, she noticed, looked almost satisfied. Her punishment was inevitable, and they had waited for it. The thought stung more than she cared to admit. Just before the doors to the courtroom closed behind her, she heard a voice, calm and yet laced with an underlying authority. The voice of the prosecutor, Ethan Miller, cut through the noise in her mind, reverberating in her chest. Justice is blind, Judge Langford. But today, it finally sees you. Those words echoed in her head long after the doors slammed shut behind her, as if the weight of her own corruption was finally being made clear. The world she had spent decades shaping had crumbled in an instant, and now she was nothing more than a prisoner of the justice she had once wielded. In that moment, Margaret Langford understood the true meaning of justice. It was relentless. It was unforgiving. And it had finally caught up to her.